It was a crisp morning in London, the kind of day that seemed to promise nothing but routine. The sky was a pale, unbroken blue, stretching endlessly above Heathrow Airport, where British Airways Flight 762 was preparing for its journey to New York City. The Boeing 777, a marvel of modern engineering, stood on the tarmac, its sleek silver body gleaming under the soft sunlight. Passengers moved through the terminal with the usual mix of excitement and weariness, some clutching coffee cups, others scrolling through their phones, all oblivious to the extraordinary events that would soon unfold. The flight crew, seasoned professionals with years of experience, went about their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. Everything appeared normal, the kind of normal that lulls the world into a false sense of security. Inside the aircraft, the cabin hummed with quiet activity. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, ensuring that every seatback was upright, every tray table stowed, and every overhead bin securely closed. The faint scent of cleaning products lingered in the air, a reminder of the meticulous care taken to prepare the plane for its next journey. Outside, ground crew members bustled around the aircraft, their fluorescent vests bright against the grey concrete. Fuel trucks and baggage carts moved in a choreographed dance, each playing their part in the intricate ballet of aviation logistics. The pilots, Captain James Harrington and First Officer Emily Carter, sat in the cockpit running through their final checks. The control panels before them were a maze of switches, dials and screens, each one a critical piece of the puzzle that would ensure a safe and uneventful flight. As the clock ticked closer to departure, the passengers began to board. They came in waves, a diverse cross-section of humanity united by the shared goal of reaching their destination. Business travelers in sharp suits carried briefcases and laptops, their minds already racing through the meetings and presentations that awaited them. Families with young children juggled strollers and carry-ons, their voices a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Tourists in casual attire snapped photos of the plane, eager to document every moment of their adventure. Each person carried their own story, their own reasons for being on this flight. But for now, they were all just faces in a crowd, anonymous and unremarkable. The engines roared to life, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the cabin and the tarmac alike. The plane began to move, slowly at first, as it taxied toward the runway. Inside, the passengers settled into their seats, some buckling their seatbelts with practiced ease, others fumbling with the unfamiliar clasps. The flight attendants moved through the cabin one last time, their eyes scanning for any potential issues, their smiles calm and reassuring. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and confident, welcoming everyone on board and providing the usual details about the flight. It was a speech he had given countless times before, each word carefully chosen to inspire confidence and calm. The plane reached the runway, its nose pointing toward the horizon, and the engine surged with power as the aircraft began its acceleration. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. The sun glinted off the wings, the engines thrummed with energy, and the plane lifted gracefully into the sky. The wheels retracted with a soft thud, and the ground fell away, replaced by the endless expanse of blue. The passengers relaxed into their seats, some closing their eyes, others gazing out the windows at the shrinking landscape below. The flight attendants began their preparations for the in-flight service, their movements efficient and unhurried. The cockpit was a picture of focus, the pilots monitoring their instruments with quiet intensity. The plane climbed steadily, slicing through the atmosphere with ease, its trajectory a smooth arc toward cruising altitude. But then, without warning, the calm was shattered. A loud metallic bang echoed through the aircraft, a sound so jarring that it seemed to freeze time itself. The plane shuddered violently, the kind of shudder that sends a jolt of adrenaline through every passenger, every crew member. In the cockpit, alarms blared, their shrill tones cutting through the air like a knife. The pilot's eyes darted to the instrument panel, where warning lights flashed in a chaotic symphony of red and yellow. Outside, on the right side of the aircraft, one of the engines was engulfed in flames, its once pristine casing now a twisted, blackened mess. Shards of metal spun through the air, trailing smoke and fire as they fell toward the earth below. The force of the explosion had damaged the wing, leaving a gaping hole where smooth metal had once been. Inside the cabin, panic erupted. Passengers screamed, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear and confusion. Overhead, bins rattled, and loose items tumbled to the floor. The plane lurched to one side, its balance disrupted by the loss of the engine. Flight attendants, trained for moments like this, but never truly prepared for the reality, moved quickly to restore order. Their voices were calm but firm, urging passengers to stay seated, to keep their seatbelts fastened. The smell of smoke began to seep into the cabin, acrid and choking, a grim reminder of the danger they were in. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging wildly as the plane continued to shake. Passengers fumbled with the masks, their hands trembling as they tried to secure them over their faces. In the cockpit, the pilots fought to regain control. Captain Harrington's hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes scanning the instruments for any sign of stability. First Officer Carter worked furiously to silence the alarms, her fingers flying over the controls as she tried to assess the damage. The plane was losing altitude, its smooth ascent replaced by a terrifying descent. The ground, once so distant, now loomed larger with each passing second. The pilots knew they had only moments to make a decision, to find a way to stabilize the aircraft and guide it to safety. Their training kicked in, a series of protocols and procedures designed for exactly this kind of emergency. But no amount of training could fully prepare them for the sheer intensity of the moment. Outside, the engine continued to burn, its flames licking at the wing and threatening to spread. The fire was a living thing, hungry and relentless, consuming everything in its path. The pilots knew they had to act quickly to shut down the engine and cut off the fuel supply before the fire could spread further. But even as they worked, another problem emerged. The damage to the wing had compromised the plane's aerodynamics, making it increasingly difficult to maintain control. The aircraft was now a wounded beast, struggling to stay aloft, its movements erratic and unpredictable. The pilots exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of their situation. They were running out of time, and the margin for error was shrinking with every second. Back in the cabin, the passengers clung to their seats, their faces pale with fear. Some prayed, their lips moving silently as they sought comfort in faith. Others stared out the windows, their eyes wide with terror as they watched the flames and smoke. Children cried, their voices high-pitched and desperate, while parents tried to soothe them with words that felt hollow even as they were spoken. The flight attendants moved through the chaos, their training overriding their own fear as they worked to keep everyone calm. They knew that panic could be as deadly as the mechanical failure itself, and they fought to maintain order in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. The plane continued its descent, the pilots battling to keep it level as they searched for a place to land. The landscape below was a patchwork of fields and roads, dotted with the occasional cluster of buildings. The pilots knew they needed to find an open space, somewhere they could bring the plane down without risking further catastrophe. Their eyes scanned the horizon, searching for a solution, a lifeline in the midst of chaos. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity as the plane hurtled toward the ground. The passengers braced themselves, their bodies tense with anticipation, their minds racing with thoughts of what might come next. And then, just when it seemed that all hope was lost, a glimmer of possibility appeared. In the distance, the pilots spotted an open field, its flat expanse offering a potential landing site. It was far from ideal, but it was their best chance. Captain Harrington adjusted the plane's trajectory, his movements precise and deliberate. As he guided the aircraft toward the field, the ground rushed up to meet them, the details of the landscape growing sharper with each passing moment. The passengers held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests as the plane descended toward the uncertain safety of the field below. The outcome was far from certain, but for now there was hope. And in that moment, hope was everything. Field below was a blur of green and brown, a patchwork of farmland that stretched out in all directions. From the cockpit, Captain Harrington and First Officer Carter could see the uneven terrain, the occasional tree or fence post that threatened to turn their desperate landing into a disaster. The plane was still descending rapidly, its damaged wing trailing smoke and flames, the remaining engines straining to keep the aircraft aloft. The pilots' hands moved with precision, their training and experience guiding them as they fought to stabilize the plane. Every second felt like an eternity, the ground rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of sheer terror. Passengers clung to their seats, their faces pale, their knuckles white as they gripped the armrests. The flight attendants, though visibly shaken, maintained their composure, their voices steady as they instructed everyone to brace for impact. The command to assume the brace position echoed through the cabin, a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Passengers bent forward, their heads tucked against their knees, their hands clasped behind their necks. Children cried there, sobs mingling with the low hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the aircraft's frame. The smell of smoke was stronger now, acrid and suffocating, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The plane's descent was anything but smooth. The damaged wing caused the aircraft to tilt precariously, forcing the pilots to make constant adjustments to keep it level. The remaining engine roared with effort, its sound a deafening reminder of the power that was keeping them in the air. For now, the ground was close now, so close that individual details could be made out. The rows of crops, the dirt roads, the occasional farmhouse. The pilots knew they had one chance to get this right. Any mistake, any miscalculation, and the plane could cartwheel across the field, breaking apart and leaving little chance of survival for anyone on board. As the plane neared the ground, Captain Harrington pulled back on the yoke, attempting to slow the descent and level the aircraft. The nose of the plane rose slightly, but the impact was still jarring. The landing gear hit the ground with a bone-rattling thud, the force of the impact sending shockwaves through the cabin. Overhead bins flew open, spilling luggage and personal items into the aisles. The plane bounced once, twice, before settling onto the field, its momentum carrying it forward at a terrifying speed. The sound of metal scraping against earth filled the air, a cacophony of destruction as the plane plowed through the field, tearing up crops and sending dirt and debris flying in all directions. The pilots fought to maintain control, their hands gripping the controls as the plane skidded across the uneven terrain. The damaged wing dug into the ground, sending up a spray of dirt and grass, the force of the impact threatening to tear it from the fuselage. The remaining engine sputtered and died, its roar replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the plane's frame groaning under the strain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane came to a halt, its nose tilted slightly downward, its tail lifted into the air. The sudden stillness was almost as shocking as the crash itself, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few minutes. For a moment there was silence. Then, as if on cue, the cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, their voices raw with fear and relief. Some struggled to unbuckle their seatbelts, their hands shaking so badly they could barely function. Others sat frozen in their seats, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The flight attendants, though visibly shaken, sprang into action, their training overriding their own fear as they worked to evacuate the plane. Smoke was still pouring from the damaged wing, and the smell of fuel hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder that the danger was far from over. Evacuate. Evacuate now. The command echoed through the cabin, sharp and urgent. The flight attendants moved quickly, their voices firm as they directed passengers toward the exits. The emergency slides deployed with a hiss, inflating rapidly as passengers began to clamber out of the plane. The slides were steep and slippery, and more than one passenger tumbled down them in their haste to escape. On the ground, the scene was one of chaos. Passengers stumbled away from the plane, their faces streaked with soot and tears, their clothes torn and disheveled. Some collapsed to their knees, their bodies trembling with shock. Others ran, driven by a primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the wreckage. The flight attendants worked tirelessly, helping passengers down the slides and guiding them away from the plane. Their calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the panic around them, a testament to their training and professionalism. Inside the cabin, the smoke was growing thicker, making it difficult to see and breathe. The flight attendants moved quickly, checking each row to ensure that no one was left behind. In the cockpit, Captain Harrington and First Officer Carter were also making their way out, their faces grim but determined. They knew their job wasn't over yet. They had to ensure that every passenger and crew member was accounted for. Outside, the field was a scene of devastation. The plane's fuselage was scarred and battered, its once sleek surface now a twisted mess of metal and debris. The damaged wing was barely recognizable, its structure warped and blackened by the fire. Smoke rose into the sky, a dark plume that could be seen for miles. The passengers and crew huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with shock. Some were injured, their faces and hands cut and bruised, their movements slow and painful. Others seemed unharmed physically, but were clearly traumatized, their bodies shaking as they struggled to process what had just happened. In the distance, the sound of sirens could be heard, growing louder with each passing moment. Emergency vehicles were on their way, their flashing lights visible even from a distance. The passengers and crew watched as the vehicles approached, their arrival a welcome relief. Paramedics and firefighters spilled out of the trucks, their movements quick and efficient as they assessed the situation. The injured were tended to first, their wounds cleaned and bandaged as they were prepared for transport to the hospital. Those who were unharmed but in shock were given blankets and water, their trembling hands clutching the items as if they were lifelines. As the emergency crews worked, the passengers and crew began to share their stories, their voices trembling, as they recounted the terrifying moments of the crash. Some spoke of the explosion, the sudden jolt that had sent the plane into a nosedive. Others described the panic in the cabin, the screams and the smoke, the desperate scramble to escape. The flight attendants were hailed as heroes, their calm and decisive actions credited with saving countless lives. Captain Harrington and First Officer Carter, though visibly shaken, were also praised for their skill and bravery in landing the plane under such dire circumstances. But even as the immediate danger passed, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The passengers and crew had survived, but they had come perilously close to death. The plane, once a symbol of safety and reliability, now lay broken and smoldering in the field, a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. For many, the experience would leave lasting scars, both physical and emotional. The trauma of the crash would linger, a shadow that would follow them for years to come. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the field, the passengers and crew were loaded onto buses and taken to a nearby hospital for further evaluation. The emergency crews remained behind, their work far from over. The plane would need to be secured, the wreckage examined, and the cause of the explosion determined. It would be a long and painstaking process, one that would take weeks, if not months, to complete. But for now, the focus was on the survivors, on ensuring that they were safe and cared for, on helping them begin the long journey toward recovery. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of British Airways Flight 762 would dominate the news, the details of the crash analyzed and debated by experts and commentators. The bravery of the crew, the skill of the pilots, and the resilience of the passengers would be celebrated, their survival a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But for those who had lived through it, the crash would always be more than just a story. It would be a defining moment in their lives, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how quickly everything could change. And as they looked back on that day, they would remember not just the fear and the chaos, but also the courage and the hope that had carried them through. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting a pale golden light across the field, where British Airways Flight 762 now lay in ruins. The once majestic Boeing 777 was a shadow of its former self, its fuselage cracked and charred, its wings twisted and broken. The field, once a quiet expanse of farmland, had been transformed into a chaotic scene of activity. Emergency vehicles, their lights still flashing, were parked haphazardly around the wreckage. Firefighters, paramedics and law enforcement officers moved with purpose, their faces grim as they worked to secure the site and tend to the injured. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and fuel, a lingering reminder of the disaster that had unfolded just hours before. The passengers and crew had been transported to nearby hospitals, their injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to more serious fractures and burns. Those who were physically unharmed were being treated for shock, their bodies trembling as they struggled to process the trauma they had endured. Families and loved ones, alerted to the crash by news reports and frantic phone calls, were arriving. At the hospitals, their faces etched with worry and relief. The waiting rooms were filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sob or whispered conversation. For many, the reality of what had happened was still sinking in, the shock of the crash giving way to a flood of emotions, gratitude for survival, grief for those who had not been so lucky, and a deep, lingering fear. Meanwhile, back at the crash site, the investigation was already underway. A team of experts from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AIB, the UK's leading authority on aviation accidents, had arrived on the scene. Dressed in protective gear, they moved methodically through the wreckage, their eyes scanning for clues, their hands carefully collecting evidence. The investigation would be a complex and painstaking process, one that could take months or even years to complete. Every piece of debris, every fragment of the plane, would need to be examined and analyzed, the data pieced together to form a clear picture of what had gone wrong. The focus of the investigation was the right engine, the site of the catastrophic failure that had brought the plane down. The engine, now a mangled heap of metal, was surrounded by a team of engineers and specialists, their tools and equipment spread out around them as they worked to dismantle and examine it. The explosion had left the engine's casing shattered, its internal components exposed and damaged. The team moved carefully, aware that even the smallest detail could hold the key to understanding what had caused the failure. Pieces of the engine were carefully catalogued and bagged, each one a potential piece of the puzzle. As the investigators worked, they were joined by representatives from British Airways and Rolls-Royce, the manufacturer of the engine. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the situation hanging heavily over everyone present. For British Airways, the crash was a devastating blow, a stark reminder of the risks inherent in aviation. For Rolls-Royce, the stakes were even higher. The company's reputation, built on decades of engineering excellence, was now on the line. If the investigation revealed a flaw in the engine's design or manufacturing, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for the company, but for the entire aviation industry. The media, meanwhile, had descended on the scene in full force. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing every angle of the wreckage. Reporters, armed with microphones and cameras, stood at the edge of the field, their voices urgent as they relayed the latest updates to their audiences. The crash had already made headlines around the world. The dramatic images of the burning plane and the heroic efforts of the crew capturing the public's attention. Speculation was rampant, with experts and commentators offering their theories on what had caused the explosion. Some pointed to a possible bird strike, while others suggested a mechanical failure or even sabotage. The truth, however, remained elusive, hidden somewhere within the wreckage. As the day wore on, the investigators began to piece together a preliminary timeline of events. The flight had taken off from Heathrow without incident, the plane climbing smoothly to its cruising altitude. The first sign of trouble had come just minutes into the flight, when the right engine had suddenly exploded, sending shards of metal tearing through the wing and fuselage. The pilots, faced with a sudden loss of power and control, had fought valiantly to stabilize the plane, their quick thinking and skill ultimately saving the lives of everyone on board. The decision to attempt an emergency landing in the field had been a risky one, but it had paid off. The pilots' expertise and calm under pressure, ensuring that the plane came down in one piece. But while the pilots' actions were being praised, the focus of the investigation remained firmly on the engine. Initial findings suggested that a fan blade within the engine had fractured, the force of the brake causing a chain reaction that led to the explosion. The blade, made from a high-strength titanium alloy, was designed to withstand the extreme stresses of flight, but something had gone wrong. Whether it was a flaw in the blade's design, a defect in the manufacturing process, or some external factor, such as a bird strike, remained to be seen. The investigators knew that answering these questions would require a thorough and meticulous examination of the evidence, one that would leave no stone unturned. As the sun set on the first day of the investigation, the mood at the crash site was one of somber determination. The wreckage, illuminated by the harsh glare of floodlights, stood as a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The investigators, their faces weary but resolute, continued their work, their movements slow and deliberate. They knew that the answers they were seeking would not come easily, but they also knew how important it was to find them. For the passengers and crew of Flight 762, for their families, and for the millions of people who relied on the safety of air travel every day, the truth was not just a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of life and death. In the days and weeks that followed, the investigation would expand, drawing in experts from around the world. The engine's components would be sent to laboratories for detailed analysis, the data scrutinized for any sign of weakness or failure. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder recovered from the wreckage would be examined for clues, their contents providing a minute-by-minute account of the flight's final moments. The pilots and crew would be interviewed, their recollections providing valuable insights into what had happened. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, the world would watch and wait, hoping for answers, and praying that such a tragedy would never happen again. The days following the crash of British Airways Flight 762 were a blur of emotions for everyone involved. While the investigation into the cause of the engine failure continued, the human stories of survival, loss, and resilience began to emerge. The passengers and crew, once anonymous faces in a crowd, became individuals with names, faces, and stories that captured the hearts of people around the world. For many, the crash was not just a moment of terror, it was a turning point, a defining event that would shape the rest of their lives. At the hospitals where the survivors had been taken, the atmosphere was a mix of relief and sorrow. Families gathered in waiting rooms, their faces etched with worry, as they awaited news of their loved ones. For some, the news was good. Their family members had survived with only minor injuries. For others, the news was devastating. Among the passengers, there were those who had not made it, their lives cut short by the explosion and the crash. The hospitals became places of both joy and grief, where tears of relief mingled with tears of sorrow. One of the survivors, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, became a symbol of resilience in the aftermath of the crash. Sarah, a 28-year-old marketing executive from London, had been traveling to New York for a business meeting. She had been seated near the wing of the plane, close enough to feel the full force of the explosion. In the chaos that followed, Sarah had suffered a broken arm and several cuts and bruises, but her injuries were minor compared to the emotional toll of the experience. As she lay in her hospital bed, surrounded by her family, Sarah recounted the moments of the crash, her voice trembling as she described the terror of seeing the engine engulfed in flames and the desperate scramble to escape the plane. Sarah's story was just one of many. There was Thomas Green, a retired schoolteacher from Manchester, who had been traveling to New York to visit his grandchildren. Thomas, a man in his late 60s, had been seated near the front of the plane. When the explosion occurred, he had been thrown forward, hitting his head on the seat in front of him. Despite his injuries, Thomas had managed to help several other passengers evacuate the plane, his calm demeanor and quick thinking earning him the admiration of everyone who heard his story. "I just did what I had to do," Thomas said modestly, when asked about his actions. "In a situation like that, you don't think, you just act." Then there was the story of the Alvarez family, a group of 5 from Madrid who had been traveling to New York for a vacation. The family, parents Miguel and Elena, and their 3 children, Sofia, Lucas, and baby Mateo, had been seated together in the middle of the plane. When the explosion occurred, the cabin had filled with smoke, making it difficult to see or breathe. Miguel and Elena had worked together to get their children out of the plane, shielding them from the chaos as best they could. Baby Mateo, just 6 months old, had been passed from person to person down the emergency slide, his tiny face a picture of innocence amidst the terror. The family's survival was nothing short of miraculous, and their story became a beacon of hope in the aftermath of the crash. But not all the stories had happy endings. Among the passengers was a young couple, James and Emily Carter, who'd been traveling to New York to celebrate their first wedding anniversary. James, a 32-year-old software engineer, had been seated near the window, while Emily, a 30-year-old teacher, had been in the aisle seat. When the explosion occurred, James had been struck by debris, suffering severe injuries. Despite the efforts of the flight attendants and paramedics, James had succumbed to his injuries shortly after the crash. Emily, who had survived with minor injuries, was left to grapple with the loss of her husband, her grief compounded by the knowledge that their life together had been cut tragically short. The crew of Flight 762 also had their own stories to tell. Captain James Harrington and First Officer Emily Carter, the pilots who had managed to land the plane in the field, were hailed as heroes for their skill and bravery. But for them, the praise was bittersweet. They had done their jobs, yes, but the crash had taken a toll on them as well. Captain Harrington, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, spoke of the moment he realized the engine had exploded, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You train for situations like that," he said, "but nothing can fully prepare you for the reality. All you can do is focus on the task at hand and hope for the best." First Officer Emily Carter, a relative newcomer to the cockpit, had also been deeply affected by the experience. At just 29 years old, Emily had been living her dream of flying for British Airways. The crash had shaken her confidence, but it had also reinforced her determination to continue flying. "It's not just a job," she said. "It's a responsibility. You have people's lives in your hands, and you have to do everything you can to keep them safe." The flight attendants, too, had their own stories of courage and resilience. Among them was 35-year-old Rachel Bennett, a senior flight attendant who had been working for British Airways for over a decade. Rachel had been in the middle of the cabin when the explosion occurred, and she had immediately sprung into action, helping passengers don their oxygen masks and guiding them to the exits. Despite the chaos, Rachel had remained calm and composed, her training and experience guiding her through the crisis. "You don't think about yourself in a situation like that," she said. "You think about the passengers, about getting them out safely. That's your job." As the days turned into weeks, the survivors began the long process of recovery. For some, the physical injuries healed quickly, but the emotional scars remained. Many of the passengers and crew sought counseling to help them process the trauma of the crash, their sessions filled with tears and difficult memories. Support groups were formed, bringing together survivors who shared their experiences and offered each other comfort and understanding. The bond that had formed among them during those terrifying moments on the plane continued to grow, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. For the families of those who had not survived, the road to recovery was even harder. Grief counselors were brought in to help them navigate their loss, their sessions filled with tears and difficult conversations. Memorials were held to honor the lives of those who had died, their names read aloud as friends and family members, shared stories and memories. The loss was profound, but so too was the love and support that surrounded them. In the midst of the grief and recovery, there were also moments of hope and inspiration. Fundraisers were organized to support the survivors and the families of those who had died. Their efforts a reminder of the kindness and generosity of strangers. The story of Flight 762 became a rallying cry for improved aviation safety, with calls for stricter regulations and better training for pilots and crew. The crash had been a tragedy, but it had also been a wake-up call, a reminder of the importance of vigilance and preparedness in an industry where the stakes were so high. As the survivors and their families continued to heal, the investigation into the crash pressed on. The answers they sought would not come easily, but they were determined to find them. For the passengers and crew of Flight 762, for their families, and for the millions of people who relied on the safety of air travel. Every day, the truth was not just a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of life and death. And as they looked to the future, they did so with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to honor the lives that had been lost and to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. Months had passed since the crash of British Airways Flight 762, and the world had slowly begun to move on. The headlines that had once dominated the news cycle had faded, replaced by newer stories and fresher tragedies. But for the survivors, the families of those who had been lost, and the investigators who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, the crash remained a defining moment, a chapter in their lives that would never truly close. The investigation into the cause of the engine failure had finally reached its conclusion. After countless hours of analysis, interviews and testing, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AAIB, released its final report. The findings were both definitive and sobering. The explosion had been caused by the fracture of a single fan blade in the right engine, a blade that had been weakened by a microscopic manufacturing defect. The defect, undetectable during routine inspections, had allowed a crack to form and grow over time, until the blade finally failed under the immense stress of flight. The failure had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction, leading to the explosion and the subsequent crash. The release of the report brought a sense of closure to many, but it also raised difficult questions. How had such a critical flaw gone unnoticed? Were there other engines out there with similar defects? And what could be done to prevent such a tragedy from happening again? The findings prompted a wave of changes within the aviation industry, from stricter manufacturing standards to enhanced inspection protocols. Rolls-Royce, the manufacturer of the engine, faced intense scrutiny and pledged to implement sweeping reforms to ensure the safety of its products. For the families of those who had been lost, the report was a painful but necessary step in the healing process, a way to make sense of the senseless and to honor the memories of their loved ones. For the survivors, the months since the crash had been a journey of recovery and reflection. Many had returned to their normal lives, but they carried the experience with them, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. Sarah Mitchell, the young marketing executive, had taken a leave of absence from her job to focus on her recovery. She had started a blog to share her story, her words resonating with others who had faced their own traumas. "The crash changed me," she wrote in one post. "It made me realize how precious life is and how important it is to live it fully, without fear." Thomas Green, the retired schoolteacher, had become something of a local hero in his hometown of Manchester. His actions during the crash had inspired countless people, and he had been invited to speak at schools and community events about courage and resilience. "I'm no hero," he would say modestly. "I just did what anyone would have done in that situation. But if my story can inspire others to be brave, then I'm happy to share it." The Alvarez family, who had miraculously survived the crash with only minor injuries, had returned to Madrid, where they were greeted as celebrities. Their story of survival, particularly the image of baby Mateo being passed down the emergency slide, had captured the hearts of people around the world. The family had used their newfound platform to advocate for improved aviation safety, their voices adding to the chorus of calls for change. For Emily Carter, the loss of her husband James had been a devastating blow, but she had found strength in the support of her family and friends. She had started a foundation in James's memory, dedicated to helping families who had lost loved ones in aviation accidents. "James was the love of my life," she said at the Foundation's launch event. "I can't bring him back, but I can honor his memory by helping others who are going through the same pain." The crew of Flight 762 had also found ways to move forward. Captain James Harrington and First Officer Emily Carter had returned to flying, their confidence restored by the knowledge that they had done everything they could to save their passengers. Rachel Bennett, the senior flight attendant, had been promoted to a training role, where she used her experience to prepare new crew members for the challenges they might face. "The crash taught me how important it is to be prepared," she said. "If I can help even one person be ready for an emergency, then it's worth it." As the survivors and their families continued to heal, they found solace in the connections they had formed in the aftermath of the crash. Support groups, both in person and online, provided a space for them to share their stories and offer each other comfort. Memorials and anniversaries became opportunities to come together, to remember those who had been lost, and to celebrate the resilience of those who had survived. The field where the plane had come to rest had been transformed into a place of remembrance, a simple memorial consisting of a plaque and a small garden had been erected to honor the lives of those who had died. The site, once a scene of chaos and destruction, had become a place of peace and reflection, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. As the sun set on the final day of the investigation, the survivors, families, and investigators gathered at the memorial for a quiet ceremony. The air was filled with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds, a stark contrast to the chaos and terror of that fateful day. One by one, they stepped forward, to lay flowers at the base of the plaque, their movements slow and deliberate. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just a simple, heartfelt tribute to those who had been lost and those who had survived. For those who had lived through the crash of Flight 762, the journey was far from over. The scars, both physical and emotional, would always be a part of them, a reminder of what they had endured, but they had also found strength in their survival, a resilience that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had faced the unthinkable and emerged on the other side, forever changed but unbroken. As they stood together at the memorial, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun, they knew that they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the memories of those who had been lost. And as they looked to the future, they did so with hope, determined to honor the past and to live their lives with courage, gratitude, and purpose. The crash of Flight 762 had been a tragedy, but it had also been a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always light.